Hi, everyone. This is a bit odd since I don't see any of you, and I hope there are people watching us right now. So just to introduce myself, if you don't know me, my name is Tom. I'm going to be one of the DCAs in Euros that would happen in less than a week. And right now we're going to go over the answers for the general judge test. Please keep your questions to the end and post them on YouTube. Igor has been kind enough to agree to post them here on chat on behalf of you. And I promise that we'll answer all of your questions. So let's start with the multiple choice questions. Or not, or yes. So question one, the one about the young Jesus of Nazareth. So the correct answer to this question is option C. We'll go over each one of the options and explain why the option that is marked is the correct option. So what can best describe the comparison between the two at this point? So option A is CG is off clash. The top half is likely to defeat CG, given that CG's analysis is Jesus of Nazareth was not Christian. Christianity and the church don't exist at the point in time where the motion occurs. And so the good of the church would not have been consideration for him. And then further argues that young Jesus wanted to reform Judaism and argues why, according to the text of the New Testament, socialism follows Jesus's vision for a better society. It is hard to claim that they are off clash on the motion this houses the young Jesus of Nazareth would preach socialism. That argument does seem to be on the clash of whether or not young Jesus should preach for socialism. Option B is CG introduced a new clash on the question of what Jesus wanted, but must defeat opposition's arguments on what's in the church's interests. So there are a couple of reasons on why this answer does not best describe the comparison between the teams at this point. A, it's untrue that they must defeat opposition arguments on what's in the church's interests in general, i.e., there are other reasons why they could beat government. So the answer that says that they must do that is incorrect. But more importantly, they do engage with opening opposition's idea or opposition's argument in general about the church's interest when they say why it matters less when we talk about the perspective of the young Jesus of Nazareth. So therefore, this answer seems to be a bad description of the comparisons between the teams. Option D says, unless CG flagged this case in a POI to top half, it should not be credited. This is incorrect because it is just not how debating works in terms of the rules. So CG have no obligation to flag this case in a POI to top half. Definitely, even if they don't do that, fully discrediting the case is completely incorrect. So answer D does not fit. Option C says that CG shifted the burdens in this debate, and given they have good enough analysis, CG is likely to defeat the top half. That answer seems the most correct, since they have changed what each side should prove. So it is not about the church's interests, but rather what is true from the perspective, or what is likely to be true from the perspective of young Jesus. Given that they do have good enough analysis, they are likely to defeat the top half, given that it is reasonable to, or not reasonable, but correct to accept their change of what are the burdens on each side of the debate, or change, or how they moved the clash in the debate. Question 2. So the question is, you are judging a debate. OG's case is defeated by OO. CG has no constructive extension, but provides a number of new responses that are sufficient to beat OO. Which of the following is true of the rankings of these teams? Again, let's move on with the options one by one. A, since CG did not provide a constructive extension, they have not fulfilled their role and thus they must take a fourth. Then rank OO above OG because they had a stronger case. There are two things that are wrong with answer A. First one is that it is untrue that given that they have no constructive extension, they have not fulfilled their role. You don't need a constructive extension in order to have an extension within the debate. If you look over the manuals, it says so explicitly: new examples, new framing, new weighing of arguments, new impacting of arguments, new analysis, or new responses to other teams in the debate should be counted as contributions to the debate. This is what it means to judge holistically the debate. There is no differentiation between providing with a reason to support the motion and with negating a reason to oppose it. Both of them have the same impact on us as adjudicators when we ask, do we want to accept or reject the proposal? The second thing that is wrong with this answer is that given that they have not fulfilled their role, even if it was true, they must take a fourth. There are no automatic fourths in a debate. CO could have done worse. Maybe CO gave a case that convinces us to actually accept the proposal and are actually convincing us against their own side, and therefore, no matter how bad CG's responses are, or even if CG have no new extension, still CO would have been worse than them, would be ranked below them. Option B, CG must come behind OG as they had no constructive extension. See my answer regarding question A. You don't need a constructive extension to have an extension or even a winning extension. Option C, it is impossible to rank these teams. OO must beat OG, CG must beat OO, but OG must beat CG. It is untrue that it is impossible to rank these teams. It would seem that CG beat OO and that OO beat OG, and that CG's responses to OO are more important than OG's case and should therefore rank them above them. And in general, it is always possible to rank teams even if the comparison is complicated or close. Option D is none of the above, which is correct since we just explained why none of the answers seem to fit. Moving on. Question 3. This house would require film studios to cast actors belonging to the identity group of the character they are portraying. So I'm not going to go over currently the long description that exists here. Just let's go quickly over the answers as well. So we're asked what can best describe the comparison between teams at this point. Option A says that given that CG gives sufficient and comparative analysis, they settle the main clash at this point in the debate. Therefore, CG is likely to be ranked above both opening teams. That seems very true, given that opening governments say here are benefits to casting these minority characters in these roles, and that O challenge them on whether we'll have more or less of these roles. If CG are then able to run an entire case in extension explaining why studios will continue producing movies with minority characters in them and why the motion creates the exact shift in incentives required to face status quo, they do settle the main question that remains at the end of the opening half of the debate and are likely to be ranked above both opening teams. But also the other answers are less true. So option B says OG shows 3 unique positive impacts while CG shows none. Therefore, OG proves the more important part of the argument and it is likely to be ranked above CG. There are 2 things wrong here. A, we don't count arguments when deciding who wins the debate. And B, it's unclear why it is the more important part of the argument at this point of the, in general, but also at this point of the debate when OO challenged them on, will we have more or less of these roles? Option C says the impacts shown by OG are not reliant on studio producers willing to make films featuring minority characters, but are inherent to the motion. Therefore, OG is likely to beat the 2 other teams. This is just logically incorrect. The impacts shown by OG are reliant on studio producers having these roles or continuing to have films featuring those minority characters. Note that the motion only gives you the fiat to require film studios to cast actors belonging to the identity group of the character they are portraying, not to write such characters. So it is not within their fiat or inherent to the motion. Option D says CG can be ranked above OG only if the whip explicitly prioritizes their case above OG's and explains why they are better. This is incorrect Well, it is true that closing have some duty or burden upon them to prioritize explicitly and explain why they beat the opening half. This is not an infinite one, considering that it seems quite clear that if CG proved what they did claim to prove, they would have a more important contribution than opening government, or at least decide the main question that remains at the top half of the debate, and therefore have a more important contribution, then they are likely to beat opening government even without an explicit prioritization and wing. Note, moreover, that I am saying that if they decide the clash, that is sufficient, because it seems that opening opposition agrees that the benefits would accrue if they would have those roles. They disagree mainly on whether we'll have significantly less roles or enough roles to have all of the benefits that opening government want us to have. Therefore, the clash in this debate was left to be decided is the point about whether or not we'll have these roles, and the analysis of why it is very beneficial seems to be less in contention in the debate, therefore less important to us as adjudicators. Question 4. This House would create and teach a unified history curriculum in the European Union. So, member of opposition gives an argument. How do you value this argument? So option A is this argument is weak as the European Union is now mostly free of biases against former colonies. This is glaringly obvious enough that the argument isn't credited even without direct rebuttal. So the main reason this answer is wrong is because it isn't glaringly obvious enough. This is an active insertion of ourselves into the debate and an active rebuttal of a point made by another speaker for no obvious reason. It is not glaringly obvious. This is not a factual claim that is obviously false for any averagely intelligent, reasonable, informed voter. So therefore, this wouldn't be reasonable to discredit this argument without direct rebuttal. Option B, this argument is very weak because it uses names of critical social theories instead of logic. Since these terms are not obvious to the average intelligent voter, this argument needs much more analysis to be effective. That is correct. Going over the analysis, everyone knows that according to post-colonial theory, those who write the curriculum only seek to entrench the existing powers in global affairs, making European schools a tool for epistemic violence against minorities. I don't know what is post-colonial theory. It is not reasonable knowledge if you only read newspapers, or even if you read all the newspapers and read the first page of them. So the reasonable informed voter shouldn't know what that means. Probably also would be slightly confused by epistemic violence against minorities and what exactly that means. Option C, this argument could have been strong if it was brought up by OO. By the time we reach the bottom half of the debate, it's unfair to introduce completely new ideas if the debate was not already revolving around these issues. Therefore, this will usually be a weak argument when brought by CO. No, CO are free to add new arguments, definitely in extension at least, even if the debate was not revolved around them. Just to give you an intuition on why that should be obviously true, if both opening half teams discussed nothing of relevance to the debate or stood up and just kept silent for 7 minutes, obviously we would be fine with CO making an argument in the debate or an argument relevant to the debate, even though the discussion beforehand didn't revolve around it. Option D, this argument is strong since it effectively sums up the relevant current academic knowledge of this issue into 2 sentences. It would require very specific knowledge to be able to effectively refute it. So, while it may be true that it effectively sums up the relevant current academic knowledge of this issue into 2 sentences, the implication that this argument is strong, therefore, is incorrect, as is explained on why B is the correct option. So even if I would sum up the relevant current academic knowledge that is very, very specific about a very, very specific conflict in the world, and therefore say, look, according to X theory, something is true, given that the judge shouldn't know the current academic knowledge that is very specific to this, because it is not knowledge that we expect from a reasonably informed voter, they shouldn't give it credit as well. Question 5. So we wrote polity debate rules. Which of these must be true? Okay, I am really sorry. This is not, oh yeah, sorry, this is polity. Which of these must be true of the team that wins a policy debate, mark all that are true. Note the words must be true. We also have repeated it through every single answer except of E. So option A is incorrect because, as we said, we're simply not counting arguments. If opening government gave 15 arguments, all of them irrelevant to the motion and with no analysis to prove why they are true or important, then even if opening opposition provided one argument that is relevant and well analyzed and well impacted, they are likely to win the debate. Option B, the team must have done the most to persuade a reasonable, neutral observer that the policy should be enacted if on gov, that it should not be enacted if on op. That is correct. Overall, this is literally the meaning of winning a debate. We are, as judges, a reasonable, neutral observer, and a team should convince us more than the three others that the policy should be enacted if they are on gov side, or that it should not be enacted if they are on op side. Option C says that team must show that the concrete benefits of their side's positive position outweigh the concrete harms. This is incorrect. You can win a debate without showing any concrete benefits of the proposal. You could win, for example, by having a principled argument that explains why it is very just or the government has an obligation to implement this sort of policy. D, the team must have addressed the most important issues in the debate according to what the adjudicator expected. The main problem with this are twofold. A, it is true that it is very likely that the team that won addressed the most important issues in the debate. However, it is not according to what the adjudicator expected to happen in the debate, but rather how the debate unfolded. Maybe the adjudicator expected for an issue in the debate to arise regarding whether or not this policy would be effective, but none of the teams discussed that, or none of the teams except CG discussed that. That doesn't mean that CG win the debate just because the adjudicator expected it to be the most important issue and the other teams did not discuss that. For example, it might be that opening opposition agreed that the policy would be effective and therefore CG's contribution is meaningless, or that both opening half teams have significantly stronger contributions than the contribution that CG provided on that question. Issues are not important according to what adjudicators expect. E, none of the above. Given that B is correct, obviously E is incorrect. POIs. You are judging a debate. OO and CG have very similar quality of arguments. They are both relevant to the debate and have analysis of very similar depth. OO has offered multiple POIs to CG, but those were never expected. Which of the following is most true? A, refusing to take a POI from a team in the debate is against the rules. CG will be placed fourth in this debate unless CO also shuts out OG. This is incorrect. Refusing to take a POI from a team is not against the rules. Nowhere in the rules say that you have to accept a POI. It definitely does not mean that CG will be placed fourth in this debate unless CO also shuts out OG. Even if it was a violation of the rules, it doesn't place that team in the fourth place. B, CG's refusal to directly engage with OO harms them in this comparison. Therefore, OO is likely to be ranked above CG. Considering that we said that they have very similar levels of analysis, similar levels of quality of argumentation, that means that their contribution to the debate is similar. At that point, engagement becomes a critical criterion, especially given that OO did not have the chance to engage with CG, but CG had the chance to engage with OO. We would be less persuaded, even to a slight extent, by a speaker who stood up after another speaker in real life and made the same quality of arguments without addressing the other speaker or without allowing the other speaker the chances to engage with them. So it does harm them in the comparative and OO is likely to be ranked above CG. Or at least this is the most true answer, as we'll go over the rest of them. Option C, refusing to take a POI does not affect the quality of material given, so the ranking should not be affected by this. Depending on how glaring the lack of engagement was, the judges can decide to subtract 3 speaker points from each speaker in CG. So there are 2 things wrong with this answer. The first one, and this one is probably even a worse mistake. You do not subtract speaker points from each speaker in CG because they did not accept the POI. This is not how speaker points work. They should reflect the contribution of the team to the debate, especially if you accept the first part of the answer, the second part cannot be correct. And also, speaker points don't work by rigid rules of subtracting and adding given things that are said or done. Secondly, if you take a POI, it doesn't affect the quality of material given, but it does affect the comparison between the teams, given that opening opposition did not have the chance to engage with closing government's material. D, this does not change the ranking or speaker points at all because CG are allowed to take POIs from CO exclusively. While it is true that CG are allowed to take POIs from CO exclusively, this does change the ranking or speaker points as a result of changing the rankings. Because, as we said, it does harm them in this comparison. Option E, it is a legitimate strategy by a team to refuse any POIs to gain more time to deliver their points. They should not be penalized for it in comparison to other teams. Excuse us for the typo in the word comparison. I wouldn't say strongly that it's not a legitimate strategy by a team to refuse any POIs. It is just strongly discouraged, given that it harms them in comparison to other teams, as explained above. So we do encourage you also to take POIs and also take into consideration POIs or chances to engage between teams, specifically when comparing closing to opening teams. Question 7. So OD makes the argument that the use of violence against the wealthy is a natural extension of the right to self-defense. I'm skipping the rest. Then OO replies with the following words. This argument misses that the system would respond to the poor's violence with even greater oppression, meaning things are worse for poor people overall. Which of the following is true of this exchange? Option A, OO's response cannot be effective without a real-world example that illustrates how ineffective a violent revolution is. That is simply incorrect. OO's response could be effective even without a real-world example. Examples solidify to an extent the logic behind the argument. They are not necessary or prerequisite for it to be an effective argument or rebuttal. B, O has shown the bigger harm, therefore the response defeats OG's argument. While it might be true that on the utilitarian metric, O has shown the bigger harm, however, it is untrue that therefore the response defeats OG's arguments, given that they have not explained why is it more important than the right to self-defense and the fact that this is an extension of it. Option C, O's response does not defeat OG's argument and its relevance to the motion is unclear and unexplained. So there are two things that make it true. A, what I said before about why it does not defeat OG's argument about the right. And secondly, given that the motion says that this house believes the world's poor would be justified in pursuing complete Marxist revolution, then it is somewhat even unclear why, even if as a response to the poor's violence, the reaction would be greater repression, it is not justified to pursue a complete Marxist revolution. Option B, OO has explained how OG's self-defense is ineffective, therefore it is also not legitimate. So while maybe O has explained how OG's self-defense is ineffective, it is unclear whether that means that it is illegitimate, and they have never explained that. Self-defense, it's unclear why in order to enact self-defense, you need it to be effective as well. Especially when opening government explain why the capitalistic structures often border on slavery and oppression, and why it is legitimate to respond to such oppression with violence as self-defense. So opening government even give us intuitive analogies and probably analysis to explain, to give us the reasons to believe why, even if it is ineffective, it is still legitimate. And definitely OO have not explained why ineffectiveness leads to illegitimacy. Question 8. This house would financially incentivize individuals to leave isolated religious communities. Opening government claim we need to pay these individuals to compensate for their isolation and the fact that they lack the knowledge and skills that the rest of society has. Opening opposition say we are fine with forcing these communities to send their children to secular state-owned schools to achieve the same goal. Later on, Elo claims that the state has no right to interfere in one's religion and one's religious choices. Which of the following is most true at this point? Option A, Elo effectively shows this policy is both unnecessary given the alternatives and is illegitimate. Thus, OO is likely to beat OG at this point. It would be very clear in a few seconds why that is untrue. We'll explain why option D is the correct one. But note that they don't explain both. There is a tension between the alternative proposed of forcing religious communities to send their children to secular state-owned schools, and the claim that the state has no right to interfere in one's religion and one's religious choices. Logically, it would be wrong to give both claims full credit. It can't be true that it is both the alternative that OO stand behind, and both that it is that we accept completely the claim about illegitimacy. It's just logically in tension. B, unless OG explicitly point out the tension in OO's case, it is irrelevant when comparing OG and OO. This is incorrect. Tension does not have to be explicitly stated by opening government. If it is logically clear to us as adjudicators, and in this case it should be, then it is not a burden OG have to meet. We just logically assess arguments as neutral observers. This is not the conclusion we should come to. C, OO's argument contradicts their proposed alternative. Therefore, the argument should be completely ignored. While it is true that there is some contradiction between their argument and their proposed alternative, the conclusion that their argument should be completely ignored is incorrect. Their two arguments are not logically in contradiction. They have tension. It is hard for us to accept logically both of them. However, they do not contradict each other. A contradiction would require argument A to say, or at least to have a very reasonable conclusion that says this is a legitimate policy, and argument B to say it is an illegitimate policy. Do not confuse tension that might harm arguments and their persuasiveness with contradiction, which is when two statements could not coexist. Option D, Elo's proposed alternative is in tension with their argument, thus weakening it to some extent. This is correct. It is not clear to us, given the information given, exactly how opening opposition analyzed their case, but we can see that there is a tension between their case and their proposed alternative. If we accept the proposed alternative, it is unclear how much their side of the house is legitimate according to their analysis. Therefore, to some extent, which we're not clear on currently, this weakens the argument. Question 9. Being a good panelist. You are a panelist in round 8 in a live room. After 10 minutes, there are a couple of comparisons left to be discussed by the panel, and the chair calls a vote on the comparison currently discussed. You are in the minority opinion. How should you conduct yourself for the rest of the discussion? Option A, I continue the discussion on other comparisons according to the chair's instructions. I may later fill in feedback on the reasons I disagree with the chair. This is correct. We trust our chairs, and it is their responsibility, but also privilege, to conduct the panel, decide what we should discuss at this point of the discussion, and take a vote when it is necessary. We should continue the discussion on other comparisons according to how the chair conducts the discussion. And it's true, you may later fill in feedback on the reasons you disagree with the chair if you think that is an important contribution besides the numerical feedback. B, I continue to make my case for the team that has lost the vote until the time for discussion is over. It would be unfair for a team to lose only because I didn't do my job properly. As said earlier, we let our judges, and they have the right to conduct the discussion and to take a vote and to ask you to stop discussing a certain comparison after a vote has been taken. It wouldn't be unfair for a team to lose only because they didn't do their job properly. They lost because the majority of the panel at this point of the discussion believes that they should lose to team X. That is how discussions and debating works. You do not have the right to hijack the discussion just because you will feel bad about a team losing to another team. Specifically not after a vote has been taken, but regardless. Option C, I move on to discuss the other comparisons according to the chair's instructions, but negotiate the speaker scores according to my original take of the debate to reflect the fact that there has been a split. So there are two things wrong there. The first one, you should never negotiate speaks because in exchange with team points. You should do your best to convince the chair according when the discussion is on, when you believe your call is correct, and contribute to the discussion as much as possible. When a vote is taken, the majority of the panel has decided on a vote. Note, moreover, this answer is incorrect because the speaks should reflect the majority's panel opinion. This is explicitly stated in the rules, but would also make sense in terms of how debating works. The team gets the full points. If the majority of the panel think they concisely defeated the other team, then even if the two other panelists disagree, the speaks should reflect the majority's decision. Option D, I refrain from speaking up about the two teams in other comparisons that might be relevant to them. Clearly, the chair doesn't value my contribution. While it is not illegal or against the rules to do so, this is definitely not how you should conduct yourself for the rest of the discussion. A, even if you lost a vote, that does not mean that the chair does not value your contribution, or even if the chair doesn't value your contribution, does not mean that you have important contribution to contribute to the panel. We put judges on panels because we believe they would have contributions. We put chairs there because they trust them to take that into account and manage the discussion. That would be a bad way to conduct yourself in this situation and would harm the discussion and the teams in the debate, and probably even your feedback, to be honest. Though that should be the last concern. Question 10. This house would allow the use of predictive algorithms to forecast a criminal defendant's risk in criminal trials. Given how long it is, I'm now going to show you part by part what is the correct option. So we're going to mark each part. Option D is the correct answer. It doesn't show here, it's on the last slide, apologies. We'll show part by part how PM preempts LO's arguments and therefore defeats them. An explanation of why a judge is likely to be biased defeats LO's analysis that just asserts that they seek to, or that claims that they seek to act out impartiality. PM provides us with reasons on why it won't happen. Next, there's a discussion about the algorithm and how it would treat minorities, given that they are more likely to offend. Note that opening government PM already preempts and explains why those decisions are likely to be better than a judge. We'll get to the better than a judge point in a second, but also why it takes all the information into account and exceptions as well. Leader of opposition just says, here are why algorithms are going to be biased against minorities. It is both uncomparative, as we'll see in a second, but also does not engage with the analysis just given by Prime Minister. And lastly, an analysis for PM on why judges are worse off in making those sort of decisions given the information, while leader of the opposition loses to that analysis directly. When LO says they are able to contrast and compare them to the matter at hand and capable of recalling past cases they ruled in, it loses to the PM. It already tells us a judge has a general idea and only knows about the cases that he has judged, unlike an algorithm that can take all of the data into account, therefore make a more correct decision. Given that, the correct answer is the PM's argument preemptively defeats LO's arguments and PM defeats LO. Specifically, it is untrue that LO's arguments are more analyzed and nuanced than PM's. They may use fancier English, but they are not more analyzed, nor are they more nuanced. Question C is incorrect, basically for similar reasons. And option A is incorrect because D is simply more correct. They are not equally persuasive. PM is more persuasive than LO. PM preemptively engages with the material that then LO does not, and therefore PM is more persuasive. PM proves to us why it is a better system, and LO just doesn't engage, and all of the analysis is defeated by the analysis given previously by PM, even if not by a huge margin. Question 11. This house would compel priests to report crimes in the the hereon of inconfession. So this was probably one of the most complex questions. Let's go over the scenario and the different answers. Member of opposition explains that compelling priests to report is illegitimate because it forces priests to act against the religious creed, leaving them with a choice between going to jail or going to hell. Opposition whip says in summary, OG explains that compelling priests to report crimes will lead to more crimes being reported and punished. O explains that criminals will now stop confessing their crimes and prevent the priests from advising them to reform or turn themselves in. We have no way of knowing which team is right, therefore this clash is clearly a wash. This means the question of legitimacy, which my partner analyzed, becomes the most important clash in the debate. Assuming opposition whip's description of the content of the arguments made by the opening half is accurate, which of the following is most true at this point? Option A, and let's actually engage with option D at the same time. But opposition whip successfully prioritizes the clash in the debate. CO is likely to defeat opening half. Option D is somewhat similar. Opposition whip successfully prioritizes the clash in the debate. More information is needed to determine the rankings. Those answers are wrong because opposition whip does not successfully prioritize the clashes in the debate. At best, opposition whip shows us that a question in the debate that was discussed in top half had maybe similar contributions from both opening teams. Note, the fact that a clash has good arguments or somewhat equal arguments by both sides does not make it less important than another clash. To solidify this sort of intuition, which is not intuition, but just factually correct, say both opening teams made very strong contributions. You would like to give both speakers of opening government a 90, you think this is the level of their speech, and both speakers of opening opposition a 91. This is a close call in which it is true that we don't have a way of knowing which team is right. This call is very close. Let's say that then closing opposition in member of opposition, analyze it to exactly the same extent provided here. No additional answers given. This is obviously significantly less good than a 90 speech. This is exactly why the fact that a question in the debate or a clash in the debate had argument, or not why, but this should give you the intuition as to why the fact that a clash in the debate had arguments from both sides on it does not make it more important. Note that this is also logically correct. The fact that claims have been made in a clash does not mean that it is less important. It is unclear why a clash that nobody else discussed becomes more important in the debate. Let's decide then between options B and C. So option B says, opposition whip's prioritization of the clash is unpersuasive, therefore C is likely to lose to opening half. Note that this is not the most true thing to say at this point. It is true that opposition whip's prioritization of the clashes is unpersuasive. It is untrue that therefore CO is likely to lose to opening half. Specifically not when answer C says more information is needed to determine rankings. That is correct. We do not know, for example, the level of analysis from each team on the respective clashes. We don't know how well opposition whip or closing opposition in general responded to claims made by opening government or closing government, which might be a factor in determining it. Given the description that we've made in the question, it is just we don't have enough information to determine the rankings at this point of the debate. Question 12. The analysis of the impact of an argument is always more important than the analysis of the likelihood of the argument. It says false. It is simply not always more important to show me, to explain more of the impact of an argument than why it is likely to happen, proving that claim A is going to happen, or that given that claim A is true, this is an important thing in the debate. There is no reason to prioritize one over the other. There could be different situations in which one of them is more important. Maybe another team in the debate considered one, for example, that an argument is impactful. They have not considered, but they have disputed the fact that it is true. But also in general, logically, proving why I care a lot about a statement if it's true is not more important than explaining that that statement is true. Last question, question 13, or at least last multiple choice question. This house believes that when allocating resources to their children, poor families should allocate most of their resources to support the most talented child in the family. So opening opposition claims with reasonable levels of analysis that this is likely to cause rivalry between siblings. CO claims with significantly better analysis that parents will make terrible decisions regarding which child to invest in, and that concentrating resources rather than spreading them is likely to lead to significantly worse economic outcomes for the entire family for various reasons. CO does not prioritize explicitly their case above OO's case of rivalry between siblings. Sorry, I'm ESL. Which of the following is most true? Option A, CO should be placed above OO since they prove significantly better a claim that seems at least as important as one made by opening opposition. We'll go over the others and explain why they are more wrong, but this option is just true. It's just given to you that they have proven significantly better a claim. It seems to me, or it seems to, I think, all reasonable people, that worse economic outcomes for the entire family seems at least on par with rivalry between siblings, if not even maybe more important, but we don't need to make the decision given significantly better levels of analysis. Option B, given CO's burden to weigh their case against opening opposition and that we can't decide subjectively that the clash about the rivalry is less important than the clash about decision making, O should be placed above CO. So it is true that CO have a burden to weigh their case against opposition, but note that in order to place CO above O, we don't need to decide subjectively that one clash is more important than the other. All we have is to assume that they are important to rather similar extents, which seems very reasonable for any person, and given closing opposition's significantly better analysis, it seems that they prove as important claim to a significantly better extent. Therefore, they are more persuasive than opening opposition, probably to a significant extent. Thus, it is completely reasonable for us as adjudicators to place them above opening opposition, even if they didn't explicitly weigh their case against the opening opposition. Option C, CO should be placed above OO since it is clear that rivalry between siblings exists under both sides of the house, thus making OO's case symmetric and unpersuasive. It is not clear that rivalry exists under both sides. If nobody mentioned this in the debate, this seems to be actively rebutting a team in the room. This is not a valid reason to place CO above OO, both because it's unclear and both because you insert yourself into the debate. So unlike the answer in which we said, look, logically, CO proved to a significantly better extent a case that seems as important, therefore are significantly more persuasive, here we're making a very subjective decision about different arguments in debate, namely we are rebutting opening opposition actively with no reason or justification to do so. D, OO should be placed above CO since if we accept the case about sibling rivalry, it makes CO's decision-making case obsolete and also proves why concentrating resources is damaging because it will always lead to rivalry. So for similar reasons to the previous answer, there are a lot of words here that just don't add up to an actual comparative analysis that makes sense. So I have no idea why it makes CO's case obsolete. It's just unclear. It seems that CO's case happens even if there is rivalry between siblings or if there isn't rivalry between siblings. And also, it is unclear why it proves why concentrating resources is damaging, except for repeating the analysis that says it will always lead to rivalry. So basically, this answer basically says they proved rivalry. This makes closing opposition obsolete. It is unclear why that last statement, why it is true that it makes CO's case obsolete. This is definitely more wrong than option A again. Before I move on to the debate video, are there any questions? None have been put to the chat, so I'll assume the answer is no. I hope somebody is watching that, by the way, in live, because I won't be able to answer questions later. Debate video. Let's start with some general comments. Firstly, the explanation for the call of the debate was the most significant part of the score each judge received. We took to account the rankings and the speaker scores, but to a much less significant extent. So even if you think you didn't get the same call as us, that does not mean you couldn't have gotten full scores, and therefore school scores for the explanation, and therefore a very high score overall. Secondly, we use the Astana UDC chair score scale, and we encourage you to do that as well, by the way, when assessing those responses. We thought it is beneficial, A, because then it means that we have the same scale that we used for the test and that would be used in the tournament, and B, because we think it is just generally a good one to use. Thirdly, this is obvious, but just to make it clear, tests were graded completely anonymously. We even went overboard and used a symmetric encryption function to make sure that it is very difficult for anybody to understand who they're grading, even if they're very malicious. Lastly, particularly good explanations would be uploaded to Facebook tonight. So you'll have written examples of some explanations for the call or some answers we thought were particularly good. In the next section, we're going to show you what we thought was the correct call for the debate and what we think is the reasonable speaker score range. And then also we'll later upload the answers that were good. But again, it is the most important part was the explanation itself. So our rankings for the debate, and after that, I'll see if there's a question before I go into a short explanation of why we thought it's ranking. So give closing opposition the first, opening government the second, opening opposition the third, and closing government the fourth. It is, in our mind as a CA team, completely reasonable to switch any two adjacent calls. So switching first and second and third and fourth is completely reasonable and was not penalized, or at least not penalized significantly or at all actually, when we made the mathematical assessment of the rankings. Again, completely different from the assessment of the explanations themselves. You could have gotten full scores with a reverse call if you provided a good explanation why that should be the call. Before I move on, I just want to check the chat for messages. So someone wants to ask a question on stream. I don't have access to the stream because I need my computer to share. So if you can just ask the question, and then I'll respond probably at the end, since it seems that we are roughly close to it, and then we'll have time to questions. Igorim would put it here for me. Thanks, Igorim, again. So feel free to just put questions in the YouTube stream, and then they'll be posted on the chat here, and I'll answer them. Next, we're going to show you what we think is a reasonable speaker points range. It's going to be quite wide to accommodate also differing opinions within the CA team, and also because we think that we didn't feel comfortable subtracting points, even if those are almost meaningless, to people who thought the speeches were slightly better or worse on the scale. So this is the scores we thought are reasonable for each speech in the debate. As you can see, some of them have a wider range than others. This is also somewhat to accommodate the ability for different rankings not to be punished double. So this would allow you, to a large extent, to provide most rankings or all rankings we believe are legitimate within them. So before we go briefly over why we view the debate the way we did, I think it's more important to discuss some common mistakes we saw repeatedly throughout the test in the explanation or the explanation of the call. So the first, and I think most obvious one, is just not being comparative, meaning some tests just explained opening government said A, B, and C. Opening opposition said 1, 2, 3. and then provided very little explanation as to how those claims interact with each other, and why, given the way that they interact and the clashes that arises, and who decides which clash, and how do we prioritize different clashes given which team won each clash, why should they win? So remember, the debate is a comparative claim. Your job as an adjudicator is not simply to recite or repeat what happened in the debate, but also explain why, given what happened in the debate, team A beat team B in a comparative way, taking into regard both how well arguments were proven, how they interacted with each other, what questions they decided, how important they are, how these interact with each other again. Second common mistake that we saw is ignoring direct engagement. So when we say direct engagement, it does not necessarily mean only rebuttal, though that also happened to a large extent, but also POIs, also framing or weighing when teams provided that. So if team provide an explanation of why a certain issue is less important than another issue, it might be important to take it into account, and we saw numerous cases in which taking that into account was lacking. So all forms of direct engagement are important and should be taken into account when comparing different teams, again, with regards to how important that engagement was in the comparison. C, and that would be somewhat similar to not being comparative, but it's different. So not stating or justifying metrics for comparison. So a lot of the time we saw tests in which people compared, or adjudicators compared team A to team B on a certain metric, but it was either just unclear actually on what metric they compared the two teams, or they provide no justification for why the teams should be compared on that metric. Specifically, some tests had very subjective or personal judgment about how to adjudicate and how to compare two teams. So for example, some tests said things in the lines of, I find this argument very interesting. I find this argument more compelling, without explaining why is it more compelling, or why the fact that it is interesting should matter to a neutral observer when adjudicating the debate. It would seem odd to pass a policy in Parliament because one of the speakers gave an interesting argument, but less persuasive overall. So remember, we're judging persuasiveness overall. You need to state the metrics by which we compare teams and also justify them. Level of analysis seems like a justified metric to compare teams on the same clash if they try to prove claims that had similar impacts, because that means that the argument that was proven to a larger extent is likely to be more persuasive because they prove the probability of outcome with similar impact to a better extent. However, that needs to be stated explicitly in the adjudication. Lastly, disregarding level of analysis. So it's going to be clear in a second when we discuss the call of the debate, but stating an argument does not equate proving an argument, and arguments can be proven to various extents. Arguments are probabilistic reasoning, so an argument could be likely to be true, very likely to be true, almost impossible to be false, or it could be almost not proven at all, and therefore we have no reason to believe it is likely. Those should be taken into account when assessing arguments and when comparing teams. The fact that a team stated that they proved a claim and gave a reason or two to support that claim does not mean that they necessarily proved the claim that they say they proved. It could be that their analysis actually logically comes to a conclusion that is different, might be weaker, might be stronger, but we should look at the analysis as provided by the teams and assess it in a logical and objective way. What exactly does it prove and to what extent? Lastly, before I actually move on to questions, yes, we do have time. I'm going to shortly describe our call of the debate. However, since actually I don't have my notes here and it's been like a couple of months since I did it. I'm sure if it's going to be somewhat lacking or not the most precise, but again, we will also publish good answers we got to the test later on. So let's start with opening government and closing opposition. So basically, opening government provide 3 important contributions probably. The first one is somewhat preemptive to opposition, which is claiming on why specifically the information they met, which is information while it is still ongoing, and specific details about the individuals involved is just unnecessary for a lot of things we think the press should do. Secondly, they make 2 claims about further harm to victims, whether current victims or future victims, both of them underanalyzed to a large extent. First one is that once the media starts to cover it, then it is more likely for the hostage takers to be more violent because A, they now know the police knows, and B, because they are afraid of losing control of the situation. Both of them are somewhat unclear as to why they changed significantly or even to any extent decision-making made by hostage takers. Secondly, they make the claim that that copycats are now more likely once we have the specific details published. This is both somewhat unclear and mitigated to some extent, or even to a large extent, by the mechanism itself of publishing everything later. Or at least it seems that they are for publishing everything later. The last claim, and probably the most substantiated one, is that press coverage in general causes harms and trauma to the family and to the victim. Some of it is mitigated or by their own mechanism. However, parts of their analysis and also parts that we did explicitly later in BPM remain relevant to the debate. Later on, it is less of a hot issue. They are still bothered less by the media while it is happening when they need their space and time. So there are 2 still reasons to believe that the situation is worse under their side. We think that closing opposition do 2 things, 3 things in the debate that allows them, and we'll explain how they beat opening government. So firstly, they give the analysis that some situations are actually ones in which the hostage takers want the publicity, and specifically, this is their goal. So in some situations, maybe they are politically motivated and they want to send a message. Given that, and given that a lot of those kidnappings, or at least some of these kidnappings, are actually opportunistic, i.e., they came across a chance to kidnap someone in a situation. However, they could also kill that person. It is more likely, given government's mechanism of getting the publicity after the situation is resolved, for them to opt now to kill the hostage, or to choose to kill instead of even taking them hostage, in order to get the publicity that they want. Meaning, more people are going to die under their side. They also claim, that to a less persuasive extent, that maybe it would also, now that this isn't a viable option, this would push terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda towards other avenues that would provide them publicity, such as bombings, etc., or terror attacks. It is unclear to us to what extent exactly are those 2 mutually exclusive and common extent, but there is some intuition to that. Secondly, they mitigate some of the harms made by opening government in 2 ways. A, explaining why a lot of the time actually the family wants publicity. It might help them to deal with it, and it's unclear why they don't want that, or why we should ban them from doing that. And secondly, why, also given opening government back, even if there is a harm, its scope and window of time in which takes place is limited, so that press coverage doesn't last forever, and that mitigates some of the harms made by the opening government. Lastly, they make some claim about it being an unjustifiable thing to do, or a illegitimate thing to do, given that it is a legitimate form of expression. This comes in two variations in different between both speakers. The first one is just the idea that this is like a unique way for oppressed parts of society when they are shut out of media to get that publicity and get their voice heard. That argument is missing quite a lot in order to actually persuade us that this is legitimate enough to the point at which not allowing to give the details is illegitimate. The second one, or a different flavor of that, comes in the whip, but was also hinted towards an extension, that this is an important decision for society and they should be involved and should be able to affect them. Let's look at how the two teams interact with each other. So firstly, in terms of the hostages' well-being, given everything we said about both teams, closing opposition provide significantly better analysis. Moreover, when opening government do get a chance to engage with the POI to opening government, they ask them, wait, but why would they kill the hostage? And closing opposition explain, in order to get the publicity, this is exactly their analysis. Because once the situation is over, then they get the publicity they wanted from hostage taking, etc. Also, this doesn't respond fully even to the rest of the logic by closing opposition. Given that also closing opposition provide direct response to the copycat when they say every novel has probably more details than the reporting of the hostage taking situation, and given the lack of analysis of both these claims, we're convinced at the end of the debate that closing opposition proved that at least in some situations, even if not all of them, things are going to be, hostages are going to be killed and not taken, and even that to some extent we're going to have more casualties maybe sometimes. On the second question of the psychological well-being of the family and the victim, we think there are two reasons to believe that closing opposition's previous contribution defeats that. The first one is to note that given opening government's analysis, even if there are psychological harms, it is really unclear to what extent they happen. And as we claimed before, while there are reasons to believe that they will occur under their mechanisms as well, they are less analyzed than the ones made by closing opposition. Given that opening government explicitly say in responses to opening opposition, also in their case, what they care most about is the well-being of the victims and their families. And when they justify their policy, say this is because we prevent harm. What was I going for? Sorry, I forgot. I lost my train of thought. It seems that opening government also care a lot about the well-being of the victim, but even regardless of that, we think that the level of analysis and the extent to which closing opposition prove the situations in which a hostage is going to end up dead is more persuasive the contribution made from opening government on the psychological harms to the family, specifically after the mitigations given by CO, and when CO say that it's just more important for them not to be dead, and that would provide benefits to opening government, one for the family. So if the hostage is dead, no family to be there, this is something that CO explicitly say. But even if they wouldn't say that explicitly, given the level of analysis and engagement between the teams, CO provide better analysis on a clash they prioritize successfully over the clash of the family and mitigate the contribution that remains from opening government, or the contribution to opening government managed to prove to a sufficient extent. Lastly, on the legitimacy, we think that it is might be an additional reason to place CO above OG, though not by itself, i.e. that makes it somewhat more of a win to closing opposition, but not to a significant extent, mainly because of two things. A, the lack of analysis from CO on why actually it is something that cannot be not reported on at the time where it occurs. It is unclear why it is legitimate. We would also add that when opening government asked them in POI, wait, do you think that 9/11 was legitimate? The response is a valid one. There is a difference between hostage taking and killing, though doesn't really explain why. And it seems to make it even less clear why hostage taking is a legitimate action if they seem to concede that killing people is not. Why is that harm significantly more acceptable than murder? And lastly, the contribution made by the opposition wing. We think it engages well with contributions made from closing government maybe, but it's definitely not enough of analysis to prove why it is wrong to promote this policy. So overall, CO prove a larger harm given how we see how the clashes interact and given the levels of analysis from both teams and the engagement between the both teams, and the justification clash ends up being less important in that comparison. Bringing in opening opposition. So opening opposition make three major claims. The first one is about the freedom of press and why this information is important for various reasons. The second one is why this might aid in some situations, maybe we'll get more information, etc. And lastly, they claim, at least in the second speech, that this isn't going to be airtight and some information would leak. So let's actually deal externally with the last contribution made from the opening opposition. There are two significant issues with that. A, it is unclear, but if we look at OO's analysis, why the ban would be ineffective. They just claim somebody would leak it. It's not even clear why that is likely to happen. Definitely not why it is likely to happen to a significant extent. So given the analysis, we can accept that some information would be out there. It is unclear how much of it and to what extent would people be exposed to it. But secondly, it is unclear what are the unique harms it does to the debate in two ways. Firstly, the analysis from opening opposition just says it is less reliable. We definitely think it is insufficient to prove a comparative harm. But secondly, given what we said about previous contributions from opening opposition, it seems to weaken them to a similar extent as the government case. So it is unclear why, even if we accept that claim, it's a claim that helps opening opposition beat the opening government. Then, regarding the clashes that remain. So opening opposition never really engaged with the idea of the family and the psychological harms done to them, except for maybe saying something in the lines of it's more important to return the hostage alive, though even that was not really explicitly stated. Then on the question of press freedom. So the main issue here with opening opposition's case is that if we look at each one of their examples and their analysis, it is just unclear why that freedom is harmed under the mechanism provided and the model provided by opening government. It is just unclear why you need the specifics and why you need the information as it occurs, not for holding the government accountable, not for even being careful. It is unclear why I need to know while the hostage taking is taking place to avoid a certain area if the data is released later, or if aggregated data is released in general, taking into account that this is a dangerous area as OO claim. It is just really unclear why that falls under the mechanism. Secondly, however, and this is crucial, opening government pointed out directly to opening opposition. So even if I would feel comfortable saying maybe some of the examples from opening opposition still occur, opening government directly challenged them on that and say, look, everything you said can be provided to sufficiently under our side of the house, both preemptively in PM and directly in DPM. When opening opposition ignored that completely, I think it is reasonable to say that the vast majority of the contribution or the vast majority of the argumentation on freedom of press from opening opposition happens under both sides to a similar extent. Lastly, on the hostage safety. So here, opening opposition make the claim that maybe more information is provided. I would honestly say that it's true that opening government give a mediocre response when they say we can have a missing person report. It is also true, however, that the analysis from opening opposition there is probably as lacking as the analysis from opening government. Honestly, the extent at which opening opposition can win that clash is probably marginal. Given all of that, it seems that opening opposition proved almost a non-existent harm to freedom of press. It seems that opening opposition at best win marginally the clash about hostage safety. It seems that even if we accept DLO's alternatives, it doesn't change a lot in the way they view the debate because it harms both arguments symmetrically. and the harms by itself attached to this argument are unclear. Given that OG do significantly better on the clash of the family's psychological well-being, and that OO will respond to that, it is just more important at this point in the debate, and they decide a clash that seems at least important to a more significant extent than opening opposition that at best marginally decide a clash in the debate, but probably also not that. Also, it should be taken into account that opening opposition just refused to engage with opening government's material as a whole, and opening government do engage with their material. This should also give us another reason to slightly favor the areas in which opening government directly respond to opening opposition, and not insert ourselves and say maybe some of the examples from opening opposition still exist. So overall, opening government contributes significantly more, maybe even to one clash, and mitigate or defeat opening opposition's contributions on the other clashes, and therefore win over them and win the top of the debate. Let's bring in CG. So CG have one main contribution, divided maybe into two, though the analysis is basically similar. Basically, CG's analysis says it is significantly worse once we have press coverage live as the event happens, because then it would put pressure on decision makers, therefore they are likely to make bad decisions. A second flavor, let's say, of this argument is something about the family and not allowing them to make the right decision, though that was even less clear. It should also be noted, CG tried to engage directly with opening opposition, though all of the responses are not only derivative, but almost repetitive of opening government, and therefore they get no credit for that. Lastly, before we compare them to the opening opposition, it should be made clear that the level of analysis of their contributions is basically what I just said. It is analysis on why it puts more pressure. The link between pressure to bad decisions is almost non-existent. Two reasons why we believe that opening opposition end up being above them at the end of the debate. The first and most obvious one, opening opposition asks them directly in a POI, wait, why would it make decision makers make bad decisions? And not, for example, pay more attention and give more resources to that. The response from closing government is, maybe in every other situation, this is what would happen, but not in this one. It is unclear why that is true. At this point, it seems that opening opposition have pointed out an alternative explanation to CG's under an unanalyzed link. It seems as persuasive as closing government's explanation, maybe even I would say more persuasive, but definitely as persuasive, and CG failed to engage with that. Given that opening opposition still has other contributions that while opening government defeated, closing government have not, closing government don't win on the question of decision making and lose, even if slightly, on the question of hostage safety, on the question of press freedom, even the examples from the opening opposition that still might be relevant, and maybe even on the question of whether some of the harms that closing government describe happen anyway, given the alternatives. So all of them, while they are not really proven, are sufficient that given that closing governments never actually actively beat opening opposition on their main clash of decision-making, would put opening opposition more ahead of closing government. But even regardless of those, given that closing government's analysis is really lacking, and it is really unclear why that is likely to happen, even regardless of opening opposition's POI, we think the contribution is not greater. Considering that, again, no direct weighing between the two teams, we tend to place closing government below the opening opposition. Cool. Now, any questions? Question one from YouTube. So I'm going to read it out loud because I'm probably getting them later. Given that question 11 says prioritization, and it is unclear that this is absolute prioritization versus a linear prioritization, in which case, why does pointing out top half is a wash and the important and the metric of knowability is not sufficient to produce marginal change in prioritization of clashes. Even if the top half clash is still more important, unclear by absolutely zero shift. So note that we ask whether that prioritization was successful, i.e., do we believe after the claims made by opposition whip that the clash that they talk about is more important than the other clash? Note specifically that this question added a metric that prioritizes another the clashes. Specifically, this question says the metric of knowability. The question asks, why is the metric of knowability not sufficient to produce marginal change in prioritization of clashes? To which I would say, A, it was not explicitly stated by opposition whip that this is a metric. They just said a wash, as if I understand what that means or why that makes a clash more important. But secondly, I would say that marginally more important is not a successful prioritization of clashes, making me believe that maybe a clash is more important is probably not the reasonable interpretation of the interpretation of clashes. But moreover, I would say I don't know why knowability or probability of a conclusion given contributions from two different teams in the debate makes a question less important. For example, if we were to discuss a nuclear war and there were very good contributions on why it is more likely under the side of opening government or less likely under the side of opening opposition, that doesn't mean the question becomes less important for me to make the decision. Maybe it means I would have to do a harder job to decide about it. But it is unclear why the fact that there were similar arguments makes a clash question less important, even marginally, even if I thought that was the case and it was reasonable for me as an adjudicator to say knowability is a reasonable metric just by saying the words wash. I hope that is a sufficient answer. And the answer doesn't ask you for a absolutely zero shift, though I do think that seriously, if we look at the debate, this is an absolutely zero shift. So all of the information the opposition whip provided to me was already there. The only additions there are calling that clash a wash and saying we talked about another clash. All that information I had beforehand, except for the word a wash, which I don't know what it means. So I do think that the correct answer is absolutely zero shift. Question 2 from YouTube. Will the slides be uploaded onto Facebook too? Miss the speaker score ranges. Yes, I like easy questions. It would be. I can also go back to it right now. Question 3 from YouTube. Hi Tom, regarding that we could only use 1,000 words, is it better in judge tests like this to explain all 6 way-offs or focus on the 1, 2, 2, 3, and 3, 4? I often do the first, but it got tight. I would definitely say the second is better given that you have limited space, just like I would say if you give rational, the explanation I gave you right now, only compare the first, second, third, fourth. I think there are 2 reasons to prioritize that. Firstly, to a large extent, a lot of comparisons are transitive, i.e. explaining why Team X beat Team Y on the important clashes and why Team Y beat Team Z on the important clashes there. Usually within, if you listen to that explanation, 95% of the time it will be very clear to understand why that means that Team X won Team Z transitively. But secondly, those are the closest comparisons. So these are the ones in which the teams made the most probably similar contribution, the ones that you had to decide the most. And I would prioritize them. Most of the times it's just repetitive to do all 6 of them. In some situations, it might make sense to, if you think, for example, the call between closing government and the opening opposition was very close, to also explain why regardless closing government would also lose. So yes, why opening government beat CG as well, as in even if this extremely close call was flipped, then still closing government would lose to opening government. But in most situations, it is usually redundant, specifically if you have a limit of words. explaining the first, second, third, fourth, if done well, usually would give all the information required to understand why first bit, third, and second bit, fourth as well. No other questions so far. Great. Cool. If you guys have any more questions, I will just stay on the call until 9:30 because I think we promised you this time. But after that, I guess we'll be done. So thanks everyone, and I hope this was helpful. And please feel more than free to ask questions if you have any. There are no bad questions, honestly. If you ask a question, that is probably because something I said was maybe somewhat unclear. That is on me. I'll just stare at the screen for 8 minutes. I guess what would actually happen is that if nobody asks a question, we'll just cut the last 7 minutes of this video instead of you having 7 minutes of me staring at the screen. Also probably cut this comment as well if we can. Thanks, Orcom. Talking to myself is not awkward at all. So actually somebody asked about the score range. I'll just return to that slide because why not? That is incorrect. Okay. So this was the speaker range. It should be noted again, the speaker scores were a small part of the video part of the test, which is not all of your test score. How was your day? This is a very nice question. Thank you. I really appreciate you taking interest in this. I guess we should also not include this in the video unless another question comes afterwards. Quite well. Very tiring. A lot of work before EUDC. It's very hot outside in Israel. Thanks, Igorim. It's very hot in Israel, so my dogs really suffer. One of my dogs is kind of lazy and old. They get tired from walking outside after like 5 minutes. They're like, nah, let's get back home. You see here? No, the other one is though. Lying on the floor, getting a chill. My day went well, thank you. How was your day? Anonymous person who I cannot even see their answer. I hope it went well as well. That was kind of mean, same person. And now we won't be able to cut this part and everybody would hear this. Okay, on a more serious note, why did you think LO outspeaks DLO? So two main reasons. The main one is that honestly, the main contribution from DLO is not responding to DPM's direct engagement to LO and then giving the analysis of the alternatives. They just provide less value in the debate. I mean, true, it's not a lot either way, given how we saw the top half in general and OO's contribution. However, LO's analysis of freedom of press, LO's analysis about safety to the hostages still proves more important things to a larger likelihood than DLO's contribution. Also, the fact that DLO doesn't respond at all to DPM weakens a lot of their contribution in their speech as well. So given that the level of analysis on why those alternative sources are likely to be very likely, except saying WikiLeaks and citing examples that seem irrelevant, not engaging with even PM's response to the POI of, look, even if we block some of them, still better. Not really explaining why, given the analysis they've just provided, this is a comparative harm. So their contribution overall, we thought was lesser than the contribution from LO. even if Elo's analysis is lacking as to why freedom of press is harmed under the model proposed by Prime Minister, and the lack of explanation on some of the other parts in their speech. Still, overall, it was more persuasive as a speech to convince us that that we should not accept the proposal. Also note that while there is a difference there, it's not very large. So different parts of the A-team had different margins between them, but I guess that the average was like 1 or 2 points. We gave, again, larger margins to reflect some of the uncertainties that we think are reasonable or provide some confidence interval to those. We have no way. So saying we have no way of knowing, therefore, is not sufficient to introduce, not prove, a metric of knowability. What is standard for identifying a metric? Thank you for doing this. We appreciate you. Thank you, guys. This is, I enjoy doing this. In case it wasn't clear, I like talking about debate. And B, this is part of my obligation, the community, when I took upon myself to be VC in this tournament. So the reason, let's make it clear. It does introduce the concept of no way of knowing. I am honestly not sure why logically, no way of knowing the conclusion after 2 teams spoke about a question means that another one is more persuasive. Just to, again, maybe solidify, just to repeat maybe the example I gave before. Imagine you really were in Parliament discussing a policy. A speaker supporting that policy says it has extremely, but it would save the world, okay? It would end global warming, we would solve that. Then a speaker from the other side says, no, it would actually lead to World War III and we'll all die. And they gave great analysis. Okay, maybe not World War III, because then it was, those are somewhat different questions. Let's say they are both on World War III, right? Opening government gave very good analysis on why that prevents it and it is likely otherwise, and not opening government. The speaker for the policy that we want to pass in the real parliament, and then the member opposing, the person opposing that policy would say, look, this is actually very likely to create exactly the situation in which World War III occurs, and we'll all die. Note that it is somewhat hard for us to decide on that question. Then another speaker opposing the policy comes up and says, look, the real problem is it's going to waste us $1,000. We should know that this is sufficient for you to oppose the policy because you know that for sure. I hope that none of us would vote against this policy, basically just on that. Note, even more specifically, I think none of us would say that they have managed to persuade us that the economic clash is more important than the one about World War III, which is what the opposition whip needed to prove in the example given. So sure, if we look at all of opposition as one block, then yes, they have provided maybe a larger contribution, given that they've given the same contribution on the really important question of World War III, and some slight benefit or harm on the economic question. However, that does not mean that the clash of the economic clash is more important than the clash about World War III. We still mostly be persuaded by that, and we would definitely not say that we were persuaded more by the second speaker opposing the actual policy in actual parliament than the first one. Now, while this was an extreme example, it does show you why knowability logically does not necessarily mean a question is more important, or it's not even clear why it could mean that a question is more important. It could be explained to me why, as a person making a decision, knowability is important. So for example, if opposition would say, look, whenever we make decisions, there are a lot of uncertainties. Here is a reason to believe why, given that we can't decide a question that makes another question more important, that would be fine. But without an explanation, they basically just says, it's hard to decide, therefore our question is more important, and it's not clear why that is true. So the prioritization in our mind is unsuccessful. The second question is what is the standard for identifying a metric? So I'll try not to make this too complex, but basically, whenever you're trying to compare two things, you need to have some ruler on which you measure them when you compare them. So if I told you something is, this is why we use the word more. It could be persuasive, it could be better analyzed, it could be more on clash, it could be more important. So I'm not sure exactly how to answer the question about what is the standard for identifying a metric, but whenever teams say, whatever comes after the word more is usually that metric, we are more X. Or if you just look logically, what they prove to you. So for example, they say, we don't know how this issue is going to be resolved, therefore that issue is more important. They implicitly stated the knowability metric there, and not explicitly. I'm not sure what is a standard for identifying a metric, but logically, technically, whenever people really compare two arguments, they must compare them on a metric, because this is like logically, it's almost like tautology, right? Because when you compare two things, you have to say on a certain measure, X is more than Y. Which measure we use as adjudicators should be first and foremost, if a measure was introduced. I have dogs, as I said before. So where was I? Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure how to answer this question. However, as adjudicators, it should always be to try and identify whenever a speaker explicitly says, this is how you should weigh between two different arguments. And if this is logically valid, prioritize using that as a metric for adjudication. And if not, then use the most objective ones possible. So logically, relevance, importance, level of analysis, those are like maybe the three main components of proving an argument logically, and therefore to persuade me for a policy. So this was sort of a messy answer to a question that I maybe misunderstood, and I apologize for that. But I hope it was somewhat beneficial still. Are there any further questions about maybe specifically about the judge test? Though I don't mind being asked how my day is going. It really makes me feel better about myself. Thank you. Cool. So thank you, everyone. If you do have further questions, you can send them to us and we'll make our best attempt at answering them. I know some of you are watching this after this has been recorded. However, sadly, given that we still have a lot of work to do before EUDC, I can't promise that we'll get to answering those. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again on Sunday for EUDC.